Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Yes, Five Nights at Freddy's 2. By now you would have seen Five Nights at Freddy's the movie, and if you haven't, I suggest turning this video off because it will contain spoilers.
Have you met them yet?
Met who?
The Five Nights at Freddy's movie itself was review bombed by critics, but fans absolutely loved it. And in terms of profitability, it had a budget of 20 million and has already surpassed 130 million worldwide in only its first week, making the sequel Five Nights at Freddy's 2 highly likely. But there is a huge problem with this. The timelines of the game are all over the place. For example, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is actually set before Five Nights at Freddy's 1, making the sequel movie, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, extremely difficult to follow that timeline. They would have to jump to Five Nights at Freddy's 3, or is there another ulterior way? And not to mention, what would the story even be? What happened to the animatronics at the end of the movie, and is Springtrap actually going to come back? Well, let me explain. Cast your minds back to the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. We see the four killer animatronics: William Afton, which is aka Springtrap, Mike Schmidt, Vanessa / aka Vanny, which is something we'll come back to later, and obviously Mike's sister. The plot then revolves around the spirits of dead children which were murdered by Springtrap, have been put into these animatronics and are being controlled by him. Now, so far it is loosely following the game's version of Five Nights at Freddy's 1, but the canon and lore is starting to get a bit muddy, as in the first game we don't really see William Afton, Mike Schmidt's sister isn't even in the game, and Vanessa doesn't appear until Security Breach, which is several games later. So if they do plan to continue following the lore and script, it means they will go into Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which is set before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's. So essentially, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 the movie will be a prequel, which will be extremely confusing for fans, as people who are not familiar with the franchise will expect a direct continuation, which I don't think will be the case, but let me continue to explain, because there are things wrong with this theory and the fact that they might skip this entirely and move into Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Now, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the game, as I said earlier, is set before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's, but it's extremely strange because the animatronics seem like an upgraded version to the animatronics we see in Five Nights at Freddy's. They have facial recognition software and able to detect predators of any kind because they're plugged into a criminal database. Not only that, they're able to freely move around the pizzaplex like we see in the movie anyway, so that's not a problem. What is a problem though is the fact that Mike Schmidt would be a young boy during this time, his sister wouldn't even be born, and there'd be no kids inside the animatronics. Well, they're spirits anyway. So if they did plan to use Five Nights at Freddy's 2's lore in the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 movie, they would have to highly adapt and change all of this. Not to mention, where would Vanessa fit in all of this? However, William Afton / Springtrap would fit nicely into this story because Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is where he commits all the murders of the children. So we could easily see the rise of William Afton, aka Springtrap, and how it comes to be, but again, that would make the movie a prequel, which again, I think would confuse the mainstream fans. Obviously, the hardcore fans like us would not be confused, but for everyone else, it wouldn't really work. So does this mean then that they would completely skip Five Nights at Freddy's 2 game's lore and move into Five Nights at Freddy's 3's lore? I mean, they did kind of show some of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 lore in the beginning sequences of the movie, where they had all the small little 8-bit scenes, Springtrap taking away and luring the kids, so they could kind of get away with moving into Five Nights at Freddy's 3. And what is that, you ask? What is Five Nights at Freddy's 3, and how will that fit into the movie? Well, let me continue to explain. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is the third installment of the series, but is chronologically the fifth game in the series, and the sequel to Five Nights at Freddy's set decades after the event of the first game. So essentially, this game would flow directly after the events of the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. Even the trailer tagline is, "He will come back, he always does, and we have a place for him." A direct link to the ending of the Five Nights at Freddy's movie where he says, "I always come back." It almost seems like it was meant to be, but there are several things wrong with this as well. The lore and events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is set 30 years after the Freddy Fazbear Pizza closed its doors. And Five Nights at Freddy's 3's big problem, it doesn't even feature the original animatronics. It only features one, and that is William Afton / Springtrap. And not to mention, the entire location of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 isn't Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, it is Freddy Fazbear's Frights, a horror attraction. They actually made a building and turned it into sort of like a scare maze with scare actors and props from the original Five Nights at Freddy's. It isn't actually set in a Five Nights at Freddy's pizza place. Because Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has become nothing but an urban legend, and they want to make the experience as authentic as possible for the Patreons. And this is where things get really interesting, because they could highly adapt this plotline, the original Five Nights at Freddy's 3 game, to the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 movie. They could essentially make the same level of plot, but bring in the old animatronics from the old pizza place and bring them to this new horror location. Because part of the original plot in the Five Nights at Freddy's 3 game is the fact that they find William Afton, aka Springtrap, and bring him to this new location. They do not find any other animatronics. So in terms of continuity, it would make the story easier to follow, but I don't think it would be as interesting as the original Five Nights at Freddy's 2 game with the toy variant animatronics. But again, there are several things wrong with this theory, so let me continue to explain. Now, it is rumoured that the Five Nights at Freddy movies are going to be a trilogy. We've already had Five Nights at Freddy's 1. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 could be focused around the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, believe it or not. Where would that leave the next installment of the trilogy? Because it gets extremely confusing after that. Because in the game's lore, Five Nights at Freddy's 4, again, is set way before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 1, and it features basic nightmare versions from a kid's dream. Five Nights at Freddy's 5, Sister Location, is a great one and something we'll touch on in just a moment, and Five Nights at Freddy's 6 is basically like a pizzeria simulator, and it's something I won't really cover too much until later. And then we obviously have Security Breach and the Glamrock variants. But all that doesn't really answer what is going to be Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and how will they continue that into a third movie, which is inevitable. So the most logical explanation to continue the movie is to kind of move on from Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the game's lore, and focus more on 3 and build that into the sequel. The only problem with this though is that Five Nights at Freddy's 3 doesn't feature Vanessa, doesn't feature Mike Schmidt's sister because she's completely new, and doesn't feature any other animatronic other than Springtrap. So how would they solve this issue? Well, it is simple. They brought Vanny into the first one so they could easily bring her back for the second, and the same thing with Mike Schmidt's sister. The only real problem I can see is bringing the existing animatronics into the new setting, because we know Mike Schmidt's sister has a connection with these animatronics. So what would the storyline be? Why would they now be hunting people in this scare maze with William Afton? Essentially, as we know, the connection Afton had to these young children in the animatronics has now been broken. The only way, in my eyes, this sequel could work is if that connection has been reaffirmed, reconnected somehow, because we want them animatronics again. The entire reason we're watching this film is to watch the animatronics go after people, essentially, you know, unaliving them. Further to this, completely skipping Five Nights at Freddy's 2 lore, we'll skip out on the puppet / marionette. Where will that come into play? Will it even be a character? And how would this play even into the trilogy? Because as I said earlier, they would plan on making this a trilogy. How would this then continue into Five Nights at Freddy's 3, the movie? Now, I did say earlier Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is very much a nightmarish game where you play as a young boy in his bedroom and he's seeing nightmare versions of the animatronics. I do not believe this would be featured in the trilogy at all, and I think they would skip again straight into Five Nights at Freddy's 5, which is Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, in the ending of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, it basically burns down. The entire pizza / scare maze gets burned to the ground, but it is hinted at that William Afton is very much alive, and that plays into Sister Location. So let me continue to explain. Now, the actual placement timeline-wise of Sister Location and where it is very much debated. Now, as the title implies, Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location, the game does not take place at one of Freddy Fazbear's pizza restaurants, featured in the previous installments and games, but instead at a sister location called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, which features its own set of animatronics. Now, the person you play as in Sister Location is, in fact, again, Mike Schmidt, which is the Mike Schmidt we see in the movie. Again, fitting this into the run of the movies, this would be perfect, because again, you'd see Mike, you'd see a brand new location, which would keep it fresh for viewers, and essentially, you would still see animatronics. How they would continue this from Five Nights at Freddy's 2 plotline, as we discussed earlier, into Los Sister Location would be a bit of a mystery, but not impossible, as we know William Afton is connected to Sister Location. Mike, after the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the movie, having it been burned down, could easily be going to find a new job, a new technician's job as such, rather than security, and the whole plot starts anew. Now, big spoiler here if you haven't played any of the games, Mike in this game is actually revealed to be the son of William Afton. This would be a huge cliffhanger for the end of the trilogy and could set up the new era of Five Nights at Freddy's movies. And further to this, it also explains how the animatronics can leave the pizza place and leave Sister Location. So if they really wanted to, they could make the sequels about the animatronics out in the world rather than follow the Security Breach timeline. This would give the new movie trilogy an endless possibility, but alas, we are getting ahead of ourselves. We promised we were only going to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the sequel, which we have done, which we know will likely follow the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, completely removing Five Nights at Freddy's 2 game's lore. Well, not removing it, because we do see some of it featured in the original movie, like I said. But alas, all this is just a theory. A game! Whoa, slow down. We are not the game theorists. But anyway, this is just a theory, guys. But what do you think the Five Nights at Freddy's sequel will be? Do you think there will even be one? The evidence suggests there will, because the monetary value and profits are up, which indicates a sequel. I'd love to know your thoughts on this matter in the comments below. If you did like this, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe, because there's plenty of Five Nights at Freddy's content on the channel. Go and check check it out now. I'm Twisted Animatronic, and stay safe out there, superstars.